Hello, 325ers. Welcome to the Peopling of America, European immigration, and African forced migration. What we're going to look at are those three things, actually, right? This is a cleverly titled PowerPoint presentation, a cleverly titled lecture, because those are the three broad categories that we're going to look at. And really, what this is also looking at is the colonial period, right? Remember back to the first lecture, the phases. This is the 1492 to 1776 lecture. We're actually going to go a little bit earlier, looking at the origins of indigenous migration into North and South America, frankly. And also, something to keep in mind is a broad perspective on what colonial migration is. Because the fact of the matter is, as we move through the course, we can begin to narrow our definition of, say, American immigration. We can actually more accurately title it as United States immigration, but we really can't do that at earliest until 1776, and probably more fairly 1783 and the signing of the Treaty of Paris to end the American Revolution. That is when the United States has borders for the first time. Certainly some of these European colonies are going to argue for borders, but those borders are really porous and undefined. The fact of the matter is that most Europeans had no idea of what actually existed outside of their very small village or very small town, right? A stat that may surprise many of you is that the United States only made up 4% of all of North America. So when we talk about immigration into what will become the United States, we need to keep a much broader idea of what that means, because those are going to have an impact on colonial immigration, but then also immigration into the United States. So we'll begin with indigenous immigration, and there's honestly a variety of ideas of the origins of indigenous immigration, ideas of how the Americas themselves became populated. Because what is really interesting is that after however it happened, after indigenous migration, after the peopling of these continents, they're largely cut off from Asia, from the West Indies, but also from Europe, right? And so this is also why we have little information. Certainly archaeological evidence is going to tell us some parts. Native peoples are going to have their own version of these events, and both of which, right, we have to keep in mind as we move forward. But in terms of the general theory, right, I assume most of you are probably familiar with the Bering Strait theory, this idea that you have these Asian bands of peoples that are hunting across in Eastern Asia, and there is a ice bridge in the Bering Strait. Let's see if I can work my pen right around here. And as they track their animals, they come in here, the ice bridge melts, and then they begin to populate, and as you can see, begin to people these places. I mentioned in the previous lecture that I had just actually read an article that said this happened about 23,000 years ago. And in fact happened in one stream, that there was one stream of people that came over, and then that stream broke off into two distinctive groups, one of which is the Amerindians, or what we largely know as Native Americans that are going to populate North and South America. There is also evidence of people coming from the Pacific Islands in boats, incredibly advanced technology. In fact, some of that boat technology is still being used today to navigate some waterways. And so you do have some finds that are pointing to earlier migrations of peoples not coming over the Bering Strait. And you also have indigenous origins of these events. And what that largely means is that indigenous people argue that they've always been in North America. In a similar sense that people originate out of Africa, Native peoples argue they originate out of their land, of their ancestry. And the surprising thing is that many of these archaeological finds continue to push these dates back, right? So one of the first finds dated at about 15,000 years ago that the Americas were populated. Well, another one cited it at about 20,000 years ago. As I mentioned, this newest find dates at about 23,000 years ago. So these dates are somewhat in flux, but there is a general consensus about archaeological evidence. But native peoples' origin stories also have to be taken into account. Importantly, for our purposes, when we talk about immigration, when we talk about the peopling of the Americas, one of the key things to keep in mind is this idea of population, of the number of Amerindians that are actually in North and South America. Because there's this sense, right? It's in our terminology, it's in our language of a new world, right? Columbus discovered the new world. Columbus landed in the Caribbean, actually, right? He didn't discover anything new. It's not as if people suddenly populated once Columbus landed. They had been there for quite some time, and in fact, their population rivaled that of Europe. If we look at the Americas, it rivals that of Western Europe. They have bigger cities, in fact. Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztec Empire, what is today modern-day Mexico City, was 5 times bigger than Seville, Spain, which just happened to be the largest city in Europe at the time, right? These native societies were incredibly advanced. They were incredibly complex. There were, at minimum, 375 different languages in North and South America at this time. In fact, if we want to look at a people that were kind of collectively more alike than others, Europe is a better example of that than, say, the Americas. The Americas are incredibly diverse, have incredibly complex societies. And importantly, it's not empty, right? We can see here, 54 million people. They're circa 1500, right on the eve of contact. This isn't an empty land, right? This isn't a virgin soil that Europeans are going to come into and going to colonize. There are people there at this time. So what do these societies look like? As I mentioned, incredibly diverse, incredibly complex. And many of the societies are incredibly large. We can look at the Mississippian society that existed from about 900 to 1100 AD. Their central city of Cahokia, which is right about modern day St. Louis. If you ever driven, what is that? I-70 through St. Louis, through Illinois into Missouri, you'll see these massive mounds that exist off, kind of away from the interstate. Those are the Cahokian mounds. Those are the Mississippian mounds. Those were built out of earthworks, right? Cahokia itself had about 40,000 people. The center temple contained about 800,000 cubic yards of earth, covered 16 acres, and rose 110 feet in the air. Tenochtitlan, for example. So this is Cahokia right here, or at least a Mississippian mound. I'm not sure if the picture I have is Cahokia itself. But this is Tenochtitlan, the central city built by the Aztecs. Incredibly complex. They built this city on a lake. And in fact, if you read memoirs from Spanish troops that are encountering Tenochtitlan for the first time, it is pure marvel at the ability of these peoples to create these types of societies. Again, societies that are far bigger than anything that they've ever seen. Technology that is far more advanced than some of their technology. In terms of weapons, it's actually a draw. The guns and things that the Spanish have, for example, aren't as effective as bows and arrows, and that'll be the case for at least a little bit of time moving forward. So on the eve of contact as well, these native societies are going through tremendous change. For example, when the settlers land in Virginia, what will become Virginia, Jamestown, they are encountering a native society, the Powhatan, that had just recently formed their own society. In Tenochtitlan, you have an Aztec empire that had been building and building and building, but building through conquest. One of the things that's going to happen with Cortez, in fact, is Cortez is going to be able to conquer the Aztecs only through the help of these disaffected native groups that had been paying tribute to the Aztecs for quite some time. So you have native societies that themselves are going through immense change, right as Europeans are going to land. And maybe the most dramatic effect of contact, right, is going to be disease and the effects of disease. And we're not just talking about one instance, one outbreak. These are going to be waves and waves of disease. You're going to have certain native groups that are going to have a first contact population that is largely killed by the first wave of the disease, but then those that are survive are still sick and then infecting other people as well. And so you're going to have another outbreak of disease, and this is going to decimate these populations. The reality is that some native groups are going to disappear entirely because of disease. They're going to be wiped out because of this disease. Remember that the Americas had largely been isolated from the rest of the world. The fact is that native peoples don't have the immunities that Europeans do. They don't have the immunities that Africans do at this time. These are called virgin soil epidemics, simply because native peoples don't have the immunities to fight them. So this gives you an idea of what we're talking about. 90% of that first contact population is going to die from disease. The Taino, the people that Columbus first encounters on his first journey, 300,000 when he lands in 1492. By 1510, 33,000. There'll be 500 in 1548. What the Taino are going to do, like many of these groups are going to do, is actually relocate and become part of another native community. Native communities are going to form and reform in the wake of contact, in the wake of what these diseases and conquest itself, right? Disease is one thing, but there's always also going to be violent conquest by Europeans. They're going to shape and reshape their society. Maybe the most striking evidence is right here, right? We showed you that on the eve of contact, American population rivaled that of Europe. By 1800, it's going to be less than 1%. They're going to lose almost 10% of their entire population due to disease. And this is going to continue to happen, right? So you see, I've added an extended example. The Mandan Indians don't encounter disease until 1837, nearly wipes them out. If you look at California, for example, the Spanish aren't going to really colonize California in earnest until about 1750. And one of the things that happens when they do, waves and waves of disease that wipe out many of the native communities. There was an immense variety of native peoples in California, and those numbers are going to be reduced by the effects of disease. And so what happens with native peoples then, right? In the wake of the violence of European conquest, the violence of these disease epidemics, how do they react? Well, the answer again is in a variety of ways. For those populations dramatically affected by disease, those such as the Taino, who reduced their numbers from roughly 300,000 to about 500, they're going to group up with and literally form new societies. This is a process that we're going to call, what scholars call ethnogenesis, the creation of a new identity. There is a population in the southeast, right around here, called the Catawba. And the Catawba are, in fact, it's a name largely given by English settlers in the region, but it's going to be an amalgamation of a lot of different tribes that have lost their elders, that have lost a connection to their ancestral history, that have lost many of their political and spiritual leaders. They're going to join up with other groups that have also lost spiritual and cultural leaders, and they're going to form new societies. In other places, I mentioned the Powhatan. In Virginia, you're also going to see this with the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast. They're going to group together to form these powerful alliances. You also actually see this in the Southwest with the Comanche, who are going to gain large control over great swaths of the Southwest, and will hold on to that until roughly the Civil War. And then a little bit after. So that's one of the adaptations, that you literally see the creation of new societies, but you also see the consolidation of existing societies into larger confederacies, confederacies that can control and largely kind of dictate to Europeans. One thing to note about Europeans is that, they're going to scatter along these coasts, right? As we move forward in the colonial period, more and more Europeans are going to come. Their societies are going to become more and more consolidated. Native peoples and Europeans are going to form this new American society, strongly influenced by one another. Native peoples are going to adopt guns in great numbers. Native peoples are going to adopt horses in great numbers. In fact, let me see if I can find it. I actually don't see them on here, but here they are, the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne are going, this is, map is from 1515. So the Cheyenne live in the Great Lakes region. What's going to happen in the wake of contact, in the wake of these groups establishing authority over themselves and over their enemies, for example, the Iroquois are going to launch massive wars against the Huron people up here in the Northeast. The Hurons are going to migrate out into the Great Lakes, actually form new societies in the Great Lakes, and begin to move people out of the Great Lakes themselves. One of those people being the Cheyenne. This process is occurring in about the middle of the 18th century, for example. The Cheyenne are going to move to the Great Plains, and the Cheyenne there are going to adopt a horse culture. The horse is going to be center to their culture. But remember, this doesn't happen until well into the 18th century, into the 19th century. So that image that many people have of a native person on horseback, one is largely created by the Cheyenne, but it's an adaptation to conquest, to violence, and to the violence wrought by European contact. So to now incorporate European immigration into this story, the first one we obviously need to start with is Spanish immigration. There's a tendency, certainly for U.S. immigration or discussions of American immigration, to begin with the English. And the reality is I'm not exactly sure why. The only thing that I can point to is this false idea that the United States is birthed out of the English colonies alone, as if no one had any influence on them. But the Spanish are in contact, conquering and in conquest of the Americas at least a century before the English settled their first permanent colony. Columbus makes contact in 1492. Jamestown isn't until 1607, right? So, and you can see here, this is the Spanish Empire in the Americas. I think it's 10 times as large as Spain itself, for example. So the Spanish are going to land in the Caribbean. This is where Columbus lands, but then they're going to make contact with the mainland. This is where we have Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs. And what they're going to find, unlike many of the other groups, is mineral wealth. They're going to find gold in Mexico. They're going to find silver in Central Mexico and South America. And Spain is going to become incredibly wealthy as a result of this. But Spanish immigration into North and South America is relatively low in terms of the amount of land that they claim control over. And this is a telling feature that we need to remember for all of these different units. Just because everything in red here is claimed by the Spanish doesn't mean that they control it. In fact, what they largely control are these centers of mineral wealth, right? Mexico City, for example, certain places in South America. As I mentioned, places in California, the Spanish aren't going to attempt to exert control, right? The mission system, if you're familiar with Californian history, doesn't begin in earnest until about 1750, 1760. And really, that's only in response to the Russians. The Russians are fishing off of the Alaskan coast. A Spanish diplomat misinterprets the maps. He thinks Alaska is right here and believes that the Russians are going to take over the west coast of North America. Spain immediately sends out expeditions these expeditions are going to have horrific consequences for the native peoples in California, what we call a dual revolution, where the Spanish are bringing not only disease, but also the animal and livestock they bring in are going to wipe out native sustenance patterns. Cows eat a lot of grass. They eat a lot of crops that native peoples grow. And so the mission system is largely a product of these dual revolutions. But it's also a reminder of this last point. The Spanish Empire, like really all of these empires, these European empires, is ethnically complex. As I mentioned, most of the Spanish immigrants are going to be young and they're going to be male. There's going to be very few women that make the migration over. And so these young men are going to take native wives. A lot of times they're going to marry into native societies as a way to establish trade, as a way to establish an inn for the Spanish Empire. And what you'll see with Spain, more so than with others, I will note, some of these groups are going to try in earnest to deny the ethnic complexity, the ethnogenesis, creation of new peoples. The Spanish are actually going to try and bureaucratize it so that there is a caste system in the Spanish Empire. You have peninsulars, which are at the top of the societies, Creoles, which are people born in the Americas, and then you essentially go from gradations of Spanish down to African in that society, with each level and each mix of people having its own gradation. Now, importantly, these aren't fixed ideas, right? This idea of permanent races, or this idea of race being a permanent identity, is not a part of these situations. You can, in fact, buy your way out of a caste system. You can actually buy your way out of being considered black in Spanish society at this time. There's going to be an evolution of the role race plays in all of these empires. Now, when we come to English immigration, which I imagine is a feature more of us are familiar with than, say, Spanish immigration, right? We have kind of two main ethos of English immigration, which is you're going to have the immigration into Jamestown and immigration into England. Now, English immigration is obviously far more complex than this. It's something that sets English immigration apart from French immigration, Dutch immigration, Spanish immigration, is this idea of settler colonization. The English aren't coming just to extract wealth out of these colonies. England is going through a population crisis at this time, and so they're going to set up these as permanent colonies, as permanent settlements for these people. They're going to try and reestablish, in some part, England in North America. Spain is going to do it too, right? You see this in many of the names: New Spain, New Netherlands, New France, New England, for example. None of these are entirely successful in replanting their former societies. As I mentioned, all of these, right? These are going to be American societies, but they're going to be equal influence from enslaved peoples that are there, from the native peoples that are there and interacting with these people, and then the Europeans that are there as well. So this is settler colonization. This idea, there's more of a permanence to settler colonization than, say, you'll see with some of the other immigrations. Jamestown, as I mentioned, 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America. There was an attempt earlier in Roanoke. It failed, and Jamestown nearly fails, and it almost fails miserably. Part of it is that Jamestown is founded on a swamp. Jamestown is not the best place to live for anyone. And in fact, Jamestown only survives because the Powhatan people don't overrun them. Powhatan, who's also the leader, is the name of the people and the leader, which is somewhat confusing. This is an English terminology than, say, a native terminology. But he incorporates the English as traders. He incorporates the English as one of the many people that are under him in the Powhatan Empire. The Powhatan Confederacy, I'm sorry. He's going to use the English against his own enemies. And so he trades with them, brings them foodstuffs. But in Jamestown, let's see, there are 104 settlers at the very beginning. 9 months after they land, only 38 of them are left alive. At one point in 1610, 3 years after landing, the group that are left actually try to leave Jamestown, but they're met in the harbor by a ship coming from England that forces them back and forces them to live. So Jamestown is an indication of both the difficulty of immigration, but also the importance of Native support, the importance of Native influence on these different societies. Jamestown is also largely an economic venture, right? The Virginian company is a joint stock company. These people are there to make money. New England, on the other hand, I mentioned this in the first lecture, is different, and it's a different type of immigration. Jamestown is largely young men. New England is going to be more family immigration than is Jamestown. New England is going to settle faster than Jamestown is. And this is the Puritan immigration, right? You have the Pilgrims that are the first set. The Pilgrims are the one allegedly seeking religious freedom. As I mentioned before, they're really seeking religious control. They actually lived in the Netherlands for quite some time where they had religious freedom. They're Calvinists. The Dutch are Calvinists. No one was preventing them from practicing their faith. But for one of the main reasons is their children were becoming too Dutch. And so they wanted to move out of there. England offers them this settlement in North America. They're originally supposed to settle near Jamestown, but a gust of wind blows them up the coast and they settle outside, what we know as New England, Boston area. But again, this is going to be a different type of immigration than Jamestown. Still also heavily influenced by Native people, heavily influenced by help from people like Squanto, but also largely helped by the effects of disease. In fact, when the Pilgrims arrive, they arrive in a location where disease had destroyed nearly 95% of the native population in that area, the Wampanoags. And Squanto, the native that helps them learn how to plant, helps them learn how to live, is a member of this society that his people have largely been wiped out by disease. So again, extended examples. But the thing about English immigration, before we move on to this other one, is you're going to see a large stream, right? As I mentioned, kind of these streaming encounter streams, they're going to go to specific places. Puritans are largely going to come into New England. People with economic ventures are largely going to come into Virginia, but then also begin to spread out from there. Now, the rest of North America, again, is also largely diverse. Even in terms of Europeans, this is going to be incredibly diverse. There's going to be a New France. Germans are going to populate all of these different colonies. And in fact, if we look at, in terms of numbers, Germans rival English immigrants into North America. The Irish are also going to be a part of these large migrations. You're also going to have Scottish, what are known as Scotch Irish, which is actually an American term for Irish Protestants. All these people are going to live throughout these areas. And you're also going to have the Dutch. And the reason that I've set the Dutch off by themselves is because I argue that the Dutch are a good representation of both immigration into America and what American society is going to look like. As I mentioned, for the English, there's this tendency to overemphasize their Englishness. Whereas with the Dutch embrace multiculturalism. It's a part of their society. The variety of peoples that live in New Netherlands is a part of their plan. They want people to immigrate there. They want people to be successful because New Netherland, while not exactly a colony run by the Dutch Republic, it's largely run by the West India Company. At least the most important parts of it are. But they allow people the type of freedom that the colonies are known for, right? The colonies are actually largely known as the best poor man's country. And the Dutch and New Netherland exemplify this, I think, better than some of the other colonies that try to overemphasize their collectiveness. So the Dutch are also incredibly important in the larger Atlantic world. It's the Dutch that are going to make the first foray against the Spanish. They're really going to make the first cracks into Spanish control of the Americas, Spanish control of the Atlantic. The Dutch are going to emerge during this period as the greatest traders in the Atlantic world, and also as the best commercial country in the Atlantic world, only to be taken over by the British, in fact. But when you look at New Netherland, which we now know as New York, New Netherland was conquered first in 1664, but then permanently in 1674 by the English, who saw the Dutch as a threat. The Dutch themselves never saw New Netherland as a primary colony. They were far more concerned about Brazil because that's where the plantations were, which allowed New Netherland to flourish in a way that other colonies couldn't. As I mentioned, they embraced the diversity that was a part of their society. The Dutch barely represented a majority of people in New Netherland. I think it's like 50.1%. So, I mean, barely a majority. And what you have are Germans, French, English, Africans, native peoples, all of them living in these communities. This isn't to say that this is harmonious. There was a lot of strife. There's slavery in New Netherland. But in terms of liberties, as I mentioned, because the Dutch Republic isn't trying to control New Netherland, there's a greater liberty for people individually. People are able to negotiate with the company directors about what they're able to do, what they're not able to do. African slaves have what they call half freedom. This isn't chattel slavery, for example. Chattel meaning property. That type of slavery existed in New Netherland, but there was also this different type of liberty that was allowed. And again, the diversity of New Netherland kind of points us to the complexity of American society writ large, as opposed to just kind of English society. Now, the last element we're going to look at are Africans. And by Africans, we largely mean enslaved people. There were some Africans that are coming to North America that are free. Actually, one of the first generations of Africans coming in were freed people. But as we move through the colonial period, African immigration is largely going to be connected with enslaved people and the forced migration of Africans. Now, there is an interesting dilemma in considering Africans as immigrants, because there's this notion that immigrants have to make a choice, right? That if you're immigrating, you have to be in control of that idea in some measure. The reality, though, is that the overwhelming majority of all people who immigrated into North America during the colonial period were unfree in some form or another, whether they were prisoners, convicts, whether they came over through the indentured system. Many of the Germans are coming over as indentured servants, some of them with contracts, certainly. And then, of course, Africans coming over, being forced over, enslaved aboard ships. But recognizing Africans as immigrants broadens our scope of immigration to recognize that unfreedom in colonial America actually dictated more than actual freedom. And in fact, we can argue that it was Africans who built the wealth that made America an enticement. Moreover, enslaved Africans are going to represent a dominant stream of migration. In many of the English colonies on the eve of the Revolution, there are more Africans in those colonies than there are English, right? Certainly in South Carolina, for example, enslaved peoples, by this point we can also include African Americans because they've been there for generations, represent a majority. About 60% of South Carolina's population are enslaved peoples. In terms of the Atlantic world as a whole, there are more enslaved Africans coming over than any other group. So to excise Africans from our conversation of immigrants not only removes the largest number of people coming over, it blinds us to the reality of colonial society and the importance of slavery in building that society and making the thing that makes America an enticement to other immigrants was built because of enslaved Africans. So this is central to American immigration. It's central to understand African immigration as a part of this. And of course, what are we talking about? We're talking about the Atlantic slave trade. Now, importantly, let's see. I think I have numbers on the next slide. So when we look at this, 1619, I have that date up there because that is the date in which the first enslaved Africans arrive in North America. They actually arrive aboard Dutch ships into Jamestown, Virginia. What makes Jamestown successful? Tobacco. Who grows the tobacco? Enslaved peoples, right? So this is fundamental to the emergence of not only American society, but also the American economy. Also, too, the Atlantic slave trade is arguably the most Atlantic process that is occurring during this time. Certainly we have all kinds of people coming over, but again, look at these massive streams that are coming over to the Americas. And the core behind the Atlantic slave trade is this idea of turning people into products. This is what we call the chattel principle. I'll write it here. Forgive my handwriting. That's an E. Chattel, which means that these people are considered property. That doesn't mean they cease to be immigrants, by the way. Just because they're treated as property doesn't mean they cease being people. But what this means then is that they're traded, bought, and sold like any other element, any other farm equipment, what have you, right? This is the central idea behind slavery. And in fact, it's what makes Atlantic slavery, what makes slavery in the Americas, North and South, different from any other type of slavery, right? Slavery existed in Europe before. Slavery exists in Africa. Slavery existed in Rome, obviously. Slavery existed in North and South America prior to contact. Slavery has been a constant in world history. But what changes with this is both the chattel principle, this idea of product, and the idea of racialization, this idea that only Africans are going to be enslaved people. So let's look at some number. I mentioned, right, this is a dominant stream of immigration. Between 12 and 13 million. This is also still an estimate. And one of the estimates that I've seen, this says plus or minus 20%. So it could be 20% more than 13 million. But regardless, this is going to dwarf all other populations of people coming across the Atlantic. Now, I will note that for North America, only about 500,000 of the 12 to 13 million are going to go to North America. So while North America itself represents a small stream. So let's go back to this. You can see here, this is a small stream coming to North and South America. The larger empires that are operating in North America, the French Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch for quite some time, have massive colonies in the Caribbean. This is where the majority of slaves are going, to the Caribbean or to Brazil. These enslaved peoples are going to make their way into North America. In fact, South Carolina is a good example as well. So is Georgia. They're largely products of Caribbean society. South Carolina, in fact, is an intentional attempt, that was a weird construction, but it's an attempt to recreate a Caribbean society in North America. Caribbean planters who feel squeezed in by larger planters make their way to South Carolina to try and replicate the wealth that is coming from the Caribbean. So it's not like just because 500,000 are going to North America that it's unaffected by the slave trade. Even then, 500,000 is a large number for people migrating into North America. And importantly, what we're going to see in North America that we don't see in other places. So you see this stat right here. Of that 12 to 13 million, nearly 2 million of them die. Death is going to be an ever-present feature of the slave trade, both when these Africans are captured, when they're transported, and when they make their way into these American societies. In America, there are going to be healthier conditions than, say, in the Caribbean. Part of the reason why the Caribbean gets so many enslaved peoples is because they die in such rapid numbers. They're essentially thrown into the teeth of this machinery. Once an enslaved person dies, they replace him with another worker. In North America, you don't have that same type of system of just sheer carnage. What you are going to have is more population stability, which means that North America isn't going to need as many enslaved immigrants because those Africans in North America are going to reproduce within their own communities. You're going to see laws created, or we'll actually get to that in a minute, but the reproduction is going to be part of the reason why those numbers are relatively low, at least in comparison with the Caribbean. Now, as you can see here, the slave ship, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the African slave trade. You're familiar with the slave ship. What I want to highlight in terms of, say, immigration, one, these ships, especially in the very beginning, were never equipped to transport people. These are largely cargo holds for goods that they're remade into transporting people. The enslaved peoples have very little room. In fact, there's probably more room in this picture than they had in real life. But the slave ship is also a place where Africans are going to begin the process of becoming African Americans. What the slave trade also does is it throws together a bunch of different African peoples, right? One of the things that is lost for many is the diversity that exists within Africa. There's this tendency to see Africa as somehow its own country, and instead of seeing it as individual populations, right? There's this false idea that Africans sold each other into the slave trade, which is demonstrably false. Africans sold the captives of their enemies of other groups that just happen to also live on the continent of Africa. They're not selling themselves. And so what the slave ship does, however, is it brings these groups in from a variety of different places, all speaking different languages, all coming from different societies, all having their own cultural, social, religious background. And it's going to, the experience of enslavement is going to create for them a unifying experience. And out of this, we're going to see the creation of African American societies, as they work together, as they struggle to survive with one another. So when we look at slavery in North America, particularly when we look at slavery as we move forward into the creation of the United States, slavery is present in every single colony. Georgia is the last colony to legalize slavery. Georgia was actually initially founded as an experiment to help promote work ethic amongst the English. But those Englishmen that lived in Georgia attached so much of their own freedom to the ability to own enslaved peoples that they forced the Georgian government to legalize slavery as a result. They marched with a banner that said liberty and slaves, right? For them, those two things are united. Liberty for whites in colonial America was the ability to own enslaved peoples. Slavery is also present all throughout the North, right? This isn't a peculiar institution just in the South. Slavery is everywhere. And again, slavery was central to American development. The reasons that the colonies produce so much wealth, the reasons that it's so attractive to other peoples is because of the labor of enslaved peoples and the wealth that they create. Now, I mentioned that just about 500,000 or so enslaved peoples are forcibly immigrating into North America. I mentioned that the first generation, actually, you had some enslaved peoples were able to buy their own freedom. They're able to live in the societies that they had once labored in. There are a small group, but a group of free Africans that are coming into this area. But what we're going to see as colonial society progresses is the racialization, the entrenchment, and the codification of slavery as a fundamental American institution. Where we're going to see by racialization, what I mean is the idea that slaves are African, or more or less slaves are black. Right? This is going to become a racial aspect of slavery that you largely don't see in other societies, whether it be African, whether it be Native. This is going to be a feature of Atlantic slavery, of North American slavery. And slavery is going to be conditioned through the law. In 1664, Virginia is going to pass a statute that says that the condition of the child follows the condition of the mother. So if the mother is free, the child is free. If the mother is enslaved, regardless of who the father is, whether it be another enslaved person, whether it be her owner, whether it be her owner's son, the child is also going to be a slave. And that slave is also going to be owned by the same person. So what we see then is a perpetuation of slavery. Slavery then becomes a permanent condition for these peoples. And as I mentioned, in North America, you're going to see generation of enslaved peoples largely living in the same place. I put this map up. 1820 is a little bit ahead of what we want to talk about. But by 1790, you can see enslaved peoples are largely living in concentrated developments along the East Coast. And what that means for us is that slave culture, slave family is going to be a central part of American society, of American development. This idea that somehow just because they were slaves, they didn't influence their master's culture, right? Or that they didn't influence American culture because they were enslaved is absolutely false. Slave culture is going to be, again, one of the dominant forms of culture in colonial society. But also, too, this one in particular, the slave family, arguably one of the most dramatic developments of enslaved peoples, because the intention, they have no protection of these families. These families can be broken up at any time. There's no marriage, like certificate they have, no marriage protection. These families the father can be sold off, the mother can be sold off at any given time. And yet what we see in North America are the creation of these slave families, oftentimes across long networks, across different plantations, which are miles and miles apart. And what you have then is, again, the continued perpetuation of African American culture in the United States. As these families are living in these areas, remember, concentrated in these certain places, their families are going to be living in these places as well. These families are going to become a central part of not only slave culture and slave society, but American society as well. So we finally then get to our conclusions after this incredibly long lecture. But what do we take from all of this, right? One of the first things that we take is indigenous migration, incredibly diverse, incredibly complex on the eve of contact. And more importantly, one thing that we can add to this is that they're going to adapt to conquest, colonization in a variety of ways, often very inventive ways that are going to shape and reshape both their societies as well as European societies. European immigration is going to come from a variety of sources. And New Netherlands offers us a unique look into the diversity itself, that all of these societies, whether it be English, Spanish, French, Dutch, are going to be made up of a variety of different Europeans, a variety of different native peoples, a variety of different Africans. Third, the immigration of Africans, the development of African American culture is central to understanding American history and the history of American immigration. Importantly, remember back to our course themes when we talk about inclusion and exclusion. African immigrants are excluded from American society. The law keeps them on the social boundaries. Society keeps them on the boundaries. And we're going to see the effects of what that means as enslaved peoples become free, as the enslaved population grows. While it's 500,000 on the eve of the revolution, by the Civil War, there are going to be 4 million enslaved people. So this is going to be an important development when we talk about American society and what is an American. And then lastly, the American mosaic. American society was multicultural and what we call triracial, right? Red, white, and black from the very beginning, right? We're going to see efforts to ignore this, right? We're actually going to see efforts that try to downplay the immense variety of peoples that are in the United States and argue that the United States is one particular thing. But that, we're going to have to wait till the next lecture.